Hello and welcome to An Incomplete History.
I'm Hilary.
And I'm Geoff.
We're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
How are you doing today, Hilary?
I'm good. Excited to have this conversation.
Oh, yes. The conversation.
Yeah.
Our first controversial conversation. Before we get started, I have to tell you, it was a little chilly here this morning.
Okay, good.
No, it was like 64 degrees.
Wow, I'm glad for you. I'm really happy for you because it's literally 100.
Harvey was not happy. I was not happy. I understand for some listeners, they were like 64 degrees. San Diego, that's pretty chilly.
It is. I know if it were 64 degrees here, I would be shivering because it's been easily 100 degrees every day for several months. So 64, I would be freezing.
Yeah. I mean, it is the beginning of October and there's a little chill in the air and it's time for the old pumpkin spice lattes to come out.
They've been out for months. Where have you been?
I ignore them until October.
Okay, well, they came out August 28th.
I have willful disregard for Halloween stuff until the beginning of October, and then I kind of embrace it. So school's back in session.
I gave out midterms today, midterm prompts.
That's midterm prompts. I bet your students love you for that.
Well, I gave them 3 weeks to complete their papers, so I think that's super generous.
SDSU, we started at the end of August, and then UCSD just started last Friday. So it's going to be a while before I can inflict midterms on UCSD students.
Right.
My state students, however, yes, very much so.
Time.
Midterm fun. Another thing October means for a lot of people is Columbus Day, second Monday of October.
I mean, if it means that I get a day off.
If it means you get a day off, sure, why not?
We don't get a day off.
Do we not?
I don't.
Oh, I don't teach on Mondays, so I don't know. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know whether I get a day off on Monday or not. Columbus Day it's kind of now, there's a big push to kind of replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. And Hilary and I kind of discussed, this is something we want to talk about, this idea of Columbus Day and kind of how it came about, what the goals for it was versus kind of this idea of Indigenous Peoples Day. And it gets to kind of broader issues in history, the way we teach history, the way the public perceives history. And I honestly think this whole question of Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, I think historians have been really lax in getting their views on this out there and kind of helping guide the public about, well, what are some good points for both arguments? I just think they've been kind of absent in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's tough ground to navigate. And I think that it's an easy controversy to avoid, really, if you want to. But I do think that there's a context for it beyond, if you disentangle the two also, that they're not the same thing, or it's not you celebrate one or you don't celebrate the other. But if you can unpack the purpose and reason behind a desire to acknowledge both things, I mean, I think that then you get into a little bit more of an interesting conversation. And actually, Alaska has Alaska Day, which is celebrated, I think, on the 18th of October. And they've always kind of just ignored Columbus Day. And arguably it's because there's a large Indigenous population in Alaska, but there are some states who just kind of ignored it. Alaska, South Dakota, Hawaii. And then, this has been going on since the early 90s. But I think for historians, if we're able to just kind of step back and go, well, wait a minute, what is Columbus Day? Why did we even start celebrating it? And I think kind of understanding the origins of it helps shed a little more light on why we would have even gone there in the first place, because it has very little to do with Columbus himself. And there's something a little bit deeper going on there.
Yeah, I think that's a big misconception as well. Why did it start to be celebrated and what's going on? So, I mean, I think what we want to do is we want to talk today about, how did Columbus Day come about? maybe, and then shift the conversation to how did Indigenous Peoples Day come about?
Mhm.
And then maybe we can have a little discussion about historical memory and Columbus and European contact with the Americas and what that means. And, hopefully we can get to maybe conveying a little bit about historians' approach it, how we kind of view this, maybe how we teach it, especially in our survey classes. Survey classes is really the only place this ever comes up for me, at least.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to addressing it because I do teach on Mondays, and I'm teaching an upper division history class on the emerging republic. And I kind of like to get their opinion on it because we're in the middle of reading Theta Purdue's Cherokee Nations and the Trail of Tears.
Oh, yeah.
So it's definitely a relevant conversation to have with the students and just kind of see where they stand on it. But do you want me to go over a
Yeah,
little bit about the history of
why
Columbus
don't you
Day?
tell us about Columbus Day?
Okay. Well, I think a lot of people, when they think about Columbus as just an individual, it's kind of weird to think that we have a day to celebrate him in a way, because I think kids always grow up with the Columbus sailed the ocean blue, 1492, that kind of thing. And it's been very much a part of our national memory. But Columbus was never on the North American continent, right? I mean, he never really even made it over to the present day United States. And so thinking back on him as this founder is more of a recent conception. Now, there have been Columbus Day celebrations or acknowledgement of Columbus as an individual as early as 1792. So thinking about the 300-year anniversary of Columbus's voyage, it was recognized right at the founding of the Republic. And we have definitely an acknowledgement of Columbus's role within United States history and context. District of Columbia, Columbus, Columbia. There's so many different landmarks that pay homage to Christopher Columbus. But it isn't until the late 19th century when we start to see this major influx of Italian American immigrants coming into the country, somewhere between 1880 and the First World War. There's a massive influx of Italian immigration, and they experience extreme discrimination for their nationality, their race, but also their religion. And it's really the Knights of Columbus who begin to lobby for a federal holiday acknowledging Columbus in order to integrate Italian Americans into a more national narrative of, hey, look, Italians have always been a part of the United States history. Italian Americans have always had a role in the founding and development of the nation. Catholicism is very much a part of the history of the United States. And it's the Knights of Columbus who begin to lobby the Roosevelt administration. It's not until 1934 that a federal holiday is commissioned in memory of Columbus Day. And it's Italian Americans use this as a celebration of their nationality, but also as their nationality as Americans, as they want to be integrated into the national narrative. And so it's this really important holiday for Italian Americans, and it's not, in my reading of it, it's not so much a celebration of Columbus or what he did or didn't do as an individual, but more so a way for Italians to feel a part of American culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a competing holiday that had been proposed that was going to celebrate like Leif Erikson or
Yeah, well,
something.
and of course that's in Minnesota, right?
Right. Well,
Yeah.
yes. But I mean, that's the thing is, I think it's Columbus is incidental maybe to this whole thing, whereas the more important goal I think of Columbus Day initially is to put Italian Americans firmly within kind of the story of the United States.
Well, and to tie in this idea that, look, Europeans have been here a very long time, right? And we are going to celebrate the Europeanness of this region. I don't know if that
Right.
makes sense, but I
Well,
mean,
and
there was a push in the 1930s to create a nationalistic narrative that rests on European domination essentially of the continent.
Right. Well, I mean, and I think it's important too for listeners to kind of understand you cannot overemphasize the anti-Catholic bias that
Oh
existed in this
yeah,
country for decades.
yeah.
Um,
And
I
that
mean,
comes with anti-Italian, really.
right, right. I mean, it's something Irish Americans had to overcome, and you can make a very strong argument that it's not until after the Civil War they finally kind of overcome that
Hmm.
hesitation to view them as part of the United States. And Italian Americans, they're part of this later wave, and they have to kind of do the thing all over again. And I think a lot of historians would point and say, Columbus Day may be the first step towards that, but it's not actually till Italian Americans serve in World War II that that population is kind of fully welcomed into kind of what it means to be part of the United States. And
I would argue that it's still an ongoing thing. I in the Northeast, my family is Italian. I'm like a little bit Italian, but my grandmother was full Italian, and her parents came over from Italy, and so a lot of her family that's still in New York, who are all Italian, we've talked to them a couple of different times, and they have made comments. I mean, we're not even talking politics. We're not even talking to try to have like an in-depth conversation, but they'll just say little comments like, I have my cousin who's basically orange and wearing a tracksuit saying, "Oh, I don't tell anyone I'm Italian. I don't want anyone to know that I'm Italian. I don't let anyone know that." And it's like, everybody knows. But
right,
she's ashamed of it. And it's kind of interesting because I think still in the Northeast where there are these heavy pockets of Italian um, people of Italian ancestry, I still think that they're in a way attempting to achieve whiteness in a way that Irish don't have to anymore. And I think that there's still somewhat of a struggle for Italians to feel like they belong. I think that new waves of immigration have potentially assisted them in that process of feeling more American than other new immigrants, particularly from Latin America. But I don't think that they're fully there yet. And I wouldn't argue that Columbus Day helps that in any way, but I think that they're still struggling with their identity.
well, I mean, it's an interesting question because, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the rise of Indigenous Peoples Day, and then we'll talk about kind of what problems the people who kind of envisioned that were trying to address. But I mean, Indigenous Peoples Day, the first one was celebrated the 500th anniversary of Columbus. So it was October 12th, 1992.
Is it Berkeley?
Um, it was Berkeley. So Berkeley's the first place it's celebrated, and it kind of slowly trickles out to other places. But I guess the late 70s is when there was a discussion that started about maybe having some kind of commemorative date that talked about kind of the experiences of Indigenous peoples in the Americas and kind of what was done to them um, when this moment happened. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with dispelling this thing of Columbus discovering the Americas. Well, you can't discover a place that people already live. However,
Right.
right. However, I think something really important is this. Adam Smith, when he's kind of conceptualizing capitalism, points to the contact between Europe, Africa, and Asia and the Americas as the most significant event in human history.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to be said there is that setting aside the idea of somebody discovering someplace and setting aside moral judgments about what transpires, half the world basically being in isolation from the other half, or the two halves from isolation from each other for millennia, and then suddenly kind of colliding with one another is something that we have to address. It is
Hmm.
something that I think on some level rises to the rises to needing some kind of commemoration. Um, it was an important event, and um, one of the biggest issues I think people have uh, is the death and destruction that kind of results from it. And I think this is where the historical community starts to fracture a little bit, and the public, parts of the public have very different ideas than people who research the area. I mean, so let me just ask you this. What do you think the casualty number is for Indigenous peoples as a result of contact?
Well into the millions. I mean, that's
Well into the millions. So give me a number.
I don't know. I mean, I know that populations, depending on where it was, I mean, 95% of the population was wiped out.
I
Right?
mean, that's 95 gets used a lot. Although when I tell you where it's from, you might not like the source. But I mean, let's take us back a little bit. Late 19th
Well,
century,
I mean, are you talking about based on disease also? I mean,
well, that's the thing is that's it depends on what we're talking about. Are we just talking about Europeans directly killing
so
Native Americans, or are
I've
we
seen
talking about
I've seen numbers as high as close to 150 million people.
right? So
So, I mean,
into the 19th century, the numbers were low, unsurprisingly, that were being generated by people. People were Some historians at the end of the 19th century would argue no more than 1 million people died as a result of contact, but they would also set the total population in the Americas before European contact at about 10 million, which is really low. I don't think any anthropologist or archaeologist today would argue the population of the Americas was 10 million in 1491. Um, on the reverse of that, you've got people arguing there were 150, 200 million people. A lot of anthropologists and archaeologists are kind of very hesitant to pin a number of that scale. And I think this is getting to how many people actually lived here is difficult.
well, I don't know if
But
that really matters in the end. I mean, the point is that most of them died as a result of
most of them died.
European
Yeah,
contact, right? And so
right. I mean, that's
whether it's 145 million or it's 100 million or it's 6 million, right? I mean, that we can't, I mean, I think going with the numbers, I don't know if it's going to make it worse or better, right? I think that just
right. Well, it's that
acknowledging
whole
the fact
calculus of
that,
suffering, right?
right. But I just think acknowledging the fact that a vast majority of a population was wiped away from the earth, right? Is
Right,
that's at the end of the day what.
right. Well, but I mean, I think there is something interesting to talk about is most of that number, most of that 95% is not intentional though. I mean, this is the thing is disease does a lot more thorough job of clearing out populations for European colonization than Europeans actively shooting people or enslaving people, everything does.
What if the disease hadn't wiped people out, though? Do you think that they would have coexisted peacefully?
I don't know. I mean, there's that whole thing of when English pilgrims arrive up in the Northeast, they find these kind of park-like environment because the population has just been decimated by disease. I don't know. I mean, would they have stopped where they stopped if there had been substantial native populations there? I mean, it's who knows.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one thing we push back against as historians is counterfactuals, right? Is like
Right.
because we can sit all day and it's like, well, what if this had happened? I mean, but we know that a substantial, overwhelming majority of native population died as a result of European contact. And I think Indigenous Peoples Day wants to address that somehow. And uh, they also want to push back against the vanishing Indian idea, right?
Well, that's the other thing, right? I mean, we're not talking about everybody's gone. We have indigenous people who are still living and thriving cultures within the United States and throughout Latin America, throughout the North American continent, right? And
Well, aren't
so,
there's like over 200 recognized tribes in the United States alone?
and there's a lot of tribes who aren't recognized, you know. I mean,
Right,
that's
right.
what
I mean,
Purdue
it's
writes about. She writes about, driving through the South Carolina backcountry and just knowing that there's a lot of indigenous people who are living their life and speaking their language on a day-to-day basis. And so to even, I think that that's where a lot of people who want to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day come out. It's like, we don't want to celebrate the arrival of Europeans because we see that as the death of our culture. And we want to
Right.
celebrate the revival and the the fact that our culture has managed to survive even in a slight bit. We would rather celebrate that because we've survived despite the incredible hardship, maybe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about this is it's so often played out as um, how do you kind of recover um, in the resilience of indigenous peoples and things. But I think a lot of people, what they end up doing is they end up demonizing Columbus himself,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of laying everything at his feet, which I think also misses a broader point. I remember it's funny when you were talking about Columbus Day right at the beginning. I was in first grade, and I don't know if they do weekly readers anymore. I don't even know if that's still a thing anymore. But weekly readers were great, and you could order books out of them, and they deliver them to your classroom, and it was really fantastic. And I remember getting this one about Columbus, and it was very sympathetic to Columbus. I just remember it had this cartoon of him in chains being taken back to
Mm-hmm.
Spain.
I
I was
remember
like,
him.
that's so unfair.
Yeah.
Poor Columbus. He was a very much a sympathetic hero, this great person who wasn't really valued in his time. And now, isn't it great because, in the 70s, we're valuing him. And it's interesting we go from that to now, I have students every year when I teach survey classes where they're like, well, Columbus is the greatest perpetrator of genocide in the history of humanity. And I feel I have to pump the brakes a little bit on that. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Columbus is not Spain. Spain is not Columbus. Does Columbus do bad things? Sure. Um, but, I don't think he's culpable for everything Spain, Portugal, France, Britain. I don't think he's culpable for everything they do.
Well, some argue that he spurred the transatlantic slave trade.
See, I would set that more at the feet of Bartolome de las Casas.
But he goes on in the rest of his life to fight for Indigenous people after. So
Well, I mean,
more recently, he's been the character that people have looked to as, oh, he's the one who was redeemed at the end of his lifetime.
de las Casas.
Yeah, De las Casas by committing himself to the service and preservation of Indigenous people
Well,
toward the end of his
I mean,
life.
right. I mean, he lobbies to get kind of the slave trade of indigenous peoples banned, but at the same time, he doesn't do anything about this burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. I mean, he seems to say, look, we need to protect Native Americans, but there's this whole other continent that we can actually use maybe if we need labor. I mean, it gets so sticky when you start to kind of valorize or vilify historical
Yeah.
actors.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit because I'm always really interested in your outlook on looking at just one character as a hero or a villain. Talk a little bit about that because I think that that's an interesting outlook.
Right. Well, I mean, I think this was something I was taught by one of my favorite professors in grad school, and he taught me a lot. And one of the things he told me early on in my career, grad school career, he said, Geoff, there very rarely do we encounter heroes and villains in history. Most everybody is somewhere in between. Obviously, there are some people who get to the threshold, get kind of a rise to the title of hero or descend to the depths of depravity they could be called villains. But most people are just kind of doing what they think they need to do to survive or whatever. And it's really hard for people to kind of accept that sometimes because we so want to valorize people. And virtually any historical actor who left much in the way of writings or opinions about things, you can find some pretty detestable material. Even if you agree with 95% or 99% of what they're saying, you can occasionally find some detestable material. And it it cracks me up when people talk about Thomas Jefferson and they'll use a quote from Thomas Jefferson to kind of support a point they're making. I was like, yeah, but the next day the guy said the exact opposite. And I think it's a much better way to approach why people do what they do, is this idea that they're not a hero, they're not a villain. They're actually doing what they think they need to do or what is best. And I think that's one thing I try to do with students when I talk about Columbus and the Spanish conquest of the Americas, is this idea of put yourself in the shoes of a Spaniard in 1492. How do you view the world? And I think that's the thing, is 1492, it's a landmark year for Spain. I mean, the Reconquista is done. They discover this, or discover in quotes, this whole landmass that Europeans don't have contact with. For them, I mean, to be a Spaniard in 1492, it must have seemed like God himself had given you this gift. And you needed to do with it what you needed to do with it.
I think that that's an interesting way to look at it. And I think trying to invite students to put themselves in the shoes of historical actors is important. I think, though, in the context of what we're discussing, Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, I think we need to consider putting ourselves now in this 21st century context of like, okay, we celebrated this guy for a little while, and it served the purpose of integrating Italian Americans into American culture. But is it time for us to explore the possibility that it's important to acknowledge the other part of what happened there? I mean, whether or not you are a Spaniard in 1492, what if you are, somebody living in the Bahamas in 1492, right? I mean,
Right.
that's, I think, what we're trying to address. And I think historians, they see the problem of, they see the complexity of it. And I don't think that they have to be mutually exclusive. I'll just say that too. I don't think that you have to celebrate one or not the other. I think that there is an acknowledgement that can go on with both. But the way that I kind of started to boil it down when we were discussing this episode is, we for centuries have repurposed holidays. Holidays serve purposes at different times in different eras. And the Catholics said, don't destroy, sanctify. So when the Catholics come in and start, seeing pagan temples or pagan worship sites, they change it into Catholicism, some version of it, right? And so basically the victor is going to be able to get to mark what we celebrate or what the national conversation is. So I think that at this moment in 2019, in this 21st century context, we're starting to see a shift of the balance of power into repurposing a celebration or repurposing a holiday, much in the same way that they might have repurposed something in the, say the 15th century.
Right.
And I think that that's what we're seeing with Indigenous Peoples Day, is that we're seeing just a shift in the way that we converse about a celebration. The other thing is, we don't want to get rid of a holiday. We love holidays, right? I mean, holidays are...
We do love our days off.
We love our days off. But I think that we're experiencing at this moment a cultural shift from celebrating one type of... Because they're both commemorating that moment. And I really like that you said that, is like, look, there are these two worlds that collide. And to just pretend like that didn't happen, for better or for worse, we wouldn't be sitting here filming this podcast if it didn't happen, right?
Right.
And
right.
so the acknowledgement, I think, is super important. But the complexity of it is, it's tough to wade through.
It is. I mean, it's a complex topic, and I think it's important, we as academics, when we're teaching the subject or talking in public about it, we kind of walk people through kind of our thinking on it. I mean, it's the interesting thing, and just, I know we're going to run out of time here in a little bit, but the interesting thing is, I walk my students through that whole process of kind of what was it like to be a Spaniard in 1492, but I also do the reverse. And I was like, okay, what is it like to be a member of a coastal tribe in Virginia, what would become Virginia, or a coastal tribe in South Florida, or a coastal tribe in the Caribbean, or when you first get contact with these Europeans? I mean, what must it have been like? And I think that's where we need to end up. Ideally, is this idea that, look, it was a seismic event in the history of humans on Earth when this happened. One side bore the brunt of that a lot more harshly than the other. But at the same time, I don't think we need to go kind of whole hog and vilify Columbus and argue he's as bad as Hitler, as bad as these worst people ever in human history. Because I just don't, I think that.
Well, I also think that that's a cop-out, because it's easy
Right.
to just say, well, if we're just mean to and hate Columbus and write him off, if we cancel Columbus, then that rights all the wrongs that have happened over the centuries, well
Right.
after Columbus even died, right?
Right.
And I think that it's a way for, sadly, white people to alleviate some of their guilt, right? Like, well, if I just hate Columbus, then that'll make everything better. But really, if we had more assistance or funding or help toward existing tribal communities, if their schools are underfunded, if we focused our efforts on more concrete things, like actually assisting the descendants of the people who were massacred as a result of that contact, to me, that's far more meaningful than a hashtag of cancel Columbus or whatever we're going to see
Right.
coming up on Twitter in the next couple days, when everybody, decides to be the armchair activist and type out their however many characters you're allowed on Twitter now to make themselves feel better about the atrocity. The fact is that it's a living, breathing entity, right? We are still in the throes of this legacy of discrimination and massacre, and canceling Columbus isn't really going to mitigate that. So that's my controversial opinion for the moment.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was a good conversation. I'd just like to thank everybody for tuning in. If you would like our podcast and would like to subscribe to it, you can do that on Apple Podcasts or wherever you found this podcast. Be sure to join us every week for new episodes. Also, if you are an Apple Podcast, shoot us a review, rate us. You can also go to our website on incompletehistory.com. You can post comments and questions there, and we will answer them. Until next time, I'm Geoff.
And I'm Hilary.
Wishing you well.